The most feared man in Chicago had never knocked on anyone's door before midnight, until the woman he thought would never leave disappeared from his life without a word. Rain hammered against the rusted fire escape outside apartment 4B, turning the narrow street below into a river of blurred headlights and neon reflections. Seo Hyunwoo stood motionless beneath the flickering hallway light, water dripping slowly from the sleeves of his black wool coat onto the cracked linoleum floor. Men like him did not wait outside old apartment buildings in the middle of the night. Men like him sent drivers, assistants, security teams. Men like him made one phone call, and doors opened automatically. But tonight, the Korean Mafia Boss stood alone, his hands empty, his jaw tight, and his pulse strangely uneven beneath the silence. Apartment 4B smelled faintly of cinnamon and laundry detergent from the hallway vent. Somewhere upstairs, an old television played muffled jazz through thin walls. Hyunwoo stared at the chipped gold numbers on the door as if they personally offended him. 3 weeks ago, this woman had still been inside his penthouse every morning before sunrise, quietly moving through rooms worth more than most people's entire lives. 3 weeks ago, she had still placed his coffee beside the piano at exactly 6:15 every morning, always 185 degrees, never too bitter, never too sweet. 3 weeks ago, the sound of soft R&B humming used to drift through the marble kitchen while Chicago slept beneath his empire. And now there was only silence. His driver had offered to come with him. Hyunwoo refused. His head of security had warned him this was beneath him. He ignored him. Because none of them understood the problem. None of them understood that for 21 days, his penthouse had felt wrong. Not empty. Wrong. The lights looked colder somehow. The piano in the corner remained untouched. Even the air inside the dining room carried no warmth anymore. He had replaced employees before. Hundreds of them. Assistants. Guards. Managers. Chefs. People came and went from Seo Hyunwoo's world constantly, usually too afraid to look him in the eye before disappearing. Again. But Zaria Vale had left behind something dangerous. Absence. The kind that settled into walls. The kind that followed him through 12,000 square feet of polished stone and glass until even sleep stopped feeling familiar. Hyunwoo finally raised his hand toward the door, then paused halfway. Strange. He negotiated million-dollar deals without hesitation. Men twice his age folded under his stare. Politicians answered his calls on the first ring. Yet standing here now, outside a modest apartment with peeling paint and weak heat, his chest tightened with something he refused to name. Because this was not business. This was not power. This was a man standing outside the only person who had ever walked away from him willingly. Inside the apartment, footsteps approached slowly. Soft. Careful. Then silence. Hyunwoo lowered his eyes briefly as the deadbolt unlocked. The door opened only a few inches at first, warm golden light spilling into the cold hallway. And there she was. Zaria Vale stood frozen in an oversized gray sweatshirt, her natural curls loosely tied back, one hand still resting on the doorknob. Her expression did not break. No tears. No panic. No trembling fear like everyone else gave him. Just surprise. Quiet, dangerous surprise. Rainwater slid down Hyunwoo's face as their eyes locked for the first time in 3 weeks. The hallway seemed to shrink around them. Neither spoke. Neither moved. Then finally, the most feared man in Chicago said the one thing nobody in his world had ever heard him say before. You left without saying goodbye. Zaria stared at him for a long moment without speaking, her fingers still curled around the edge of the door as rainwater gathered beneath his shoes in the dim hallway. Seo Hyunwoo looked different tonight. Not weaker. Men like him never looked weak. But stripped down somehow. The sharp perfection was gone from his appearance. His dark hair was damp from the storm, his white dress shirt wrinkled beneath the black coat he had clearly thrown on in a hurry, and the shadows beneath his eyes looked deeper than she remembered. Chicago newspapers called him untouchable. Business channels called him brilliant. Rivals called him dangerous when they thought nobody was listening. Yet standing here outside her apartment after midnight, he looked like a man who had not slept properly in weeks. Zarya finally stepped back from the doorway, but only enough to keep the rain from blowing inside. "You are standing in front of my apartment at 1:30 in the morning," she said quietly. "That means something is very wrong." Her voice remained calm, steady, impossible to read. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Hyunwoo glanced briefly past her shoulder. The apartment was small. Warm yellow light from a standing lamp softened the old walls, and somewhere inside, soft jazz played low from a tiny speaker near the kitchen sink. A stack of library books rested beside the couch. One of her sneakers lay near the heater vent drying from the rain. Ordinary things. Peaceful things. He had spent years surrounding himself with marble floors, private elevators, imported art, and men who measured loyalty in contracts and silence. Yet this cramped apartment felt more human than his entire penthouse. "Are you going to invite me inside?" he asked at last. Zarya almost smiled at that. Almost. No, the answer landed without hesitation. Hyunwoo blinked once, surprised by the directness. Most people folded beneath his gaze after 2 seconds. Zarya Vale never had. She crossed her arms lightly over her chest and leaned against the doorframe. "You ignored me for 8 months unless something in your house stopped working," she continued softly. "Now suddenly you are outside my building in the rain. So no, Mr. CO. You do not get invited inside automatically." Somewhere downstairs, a neighbor's door slammed shut. The hallway lights flickered once. Hyunwoo lowered his eyes briefly before looking back at her. "I came alone. I noticed. No security. No driver." "I noticed that too." He studied her face carefully, trying to find traces of softness, but Zarya had always been difficult to read when she was hurt. That was part of what made her dangerous to him. She never begged for attention. Never chased approval. She simply gave quietly until she had nothing left to offer, and then she disappeared. "You blocked the company phone number," he said. "And the penthouse line." "Yes. My assistant emailed you 6 times. "I know." Rain continued tapping softly against the windows at the end of the hallway. Hyunwoo slipped one hand into his coat pocket slowly, almost uncertain what to do with himself. Strange. He had negotiated international deals with less tension than this conversation. "You left your staff key on the kitchen counter," he said quietly. "You did not even leave a note." For the first time, something shifted behind Zarya's eyes. Not guilt. Pain. Small but visible. "Because if I wrote down what I really wanted to say," she replied carefully, "I probably would not have left at all." The hallway fell silent again. Hyunwoo felt those words settle somewhere deep inside his chest before he could stop them. And suddenly he understood something terrifying. This was not about losing an employee. It never had been. Hyunwoo did not answer immediately. He simply stood there in the dim hallway while rain whispered against the old apartment windows behind him, his expression unreadable beneath the weak yellow light. Zarya watched him carefully, and for a moment she almost hated herself for noticing the exhaustion in his face. Almost. Because this was still the same man who once made an entire room fall silent with one glance. The same man whose schedule was planned down to the minute by assistants too nervous to breathe incorrectly around him. Yet now he looked strangely lost standing outside her apartment with water dripping from his coat cuffs onto the floor. "You should go home," she said softly after a while. "It is late." Home. The word landed strangely in his chest. Hyunwoo looked past her again into the small apartment glowing with warmth and ordinary life. A faded blanket rested over the couch arm. Steam curled gently from a mug on the kitchen counter. There was music here. Softness. Things his penthouse had never truly contained, no matter how expensive it became. "I have not slept well since you left," he admitted quietly. Zarya's eyes flickered for half a second before settling again. That is not my responsibility anymore. The honesty in her voice cut deeper than anger could have. She was not cruel about it. That was the problem. Zarya Vale never weaponized emotion. She simply told the truth plainly and let silence do the damage afterward. Hyunwoo lowered his gaze briefly, remembering the first day she arrived at the penthouse almost a year earlier. She had walked through 12-foot glass doors wearing a dark blue coat 2 sizes too large and carrying a worn leather tote bag against her shoulder. No designer labels. No nervous chatter. Most new staff members avoided eye contact entirely during orientation. Zarya had looked directly at him once while signing paperwork in the kitchen and said calmly, "Your house is beautiful, but it feels cold in here." The entire room had frozen. His head of security nearly dropped his coffee. Nobody spoke to Seo Hyunwoo that way. But instead of anger, something strange had happened. Hyunwoo remembered studying her quietly while she adjusted the sleeve of her sweater with complete calm. No fear. No performance. Just honesty. "Cold does not bother me," he had replied back then. Zarya had glanced around the silent marble kitchen before answering softly, "Maybe that is the problem." He should have fired her immediately. Instead, he spent the rest of the morning thinking about those words. Slowly, impossibly, she became part of the rhythm of his life. Not loudly. Never dramatically. She simply appeared in the empty spaces nobody else noticed. She learned he worked until 3 in the morning and quietly started leaving tea beside the piano without being asked. She noticed he skipped meals during stressful weeks and began placing small containers of food near his office door. She learned the exact volume he preferred for jazz records during sleepless nights. Nobody ordered her to do any of it. She simply paid attention. And that terrified him more than enemies ever had. Because attention creates attachment. Attachment creates weakness. Men like Seo Hyunwoo survived by needing nothing. Yet somewhere between late-night piano melodies and untouched cups of tea, Zarya Vale had quietly become the calmest part of his world. "You know what the strange thing is?" Hyunwoo said finally, his voice low against the rain. "After you left, everyone inside that penthouse kept doing their jobs perfectly." Zarya remained silent. He looked at her then with an honesty so rare it almost felt dangerous. "But somehow," he said quietly, "everything still felt broken." Zarya looked away first. Not because his words did not affect her, but because they affected her too much. She stepped back slightly from the doorway and wrapped her fingers around the sleeve of her sweatshirt as warm jazz drifted softly through the apartment behind her. Hyunwoo noticed the movement immediately. He always noticed small things about her. That was the problem neither of them wanted to say out loud. "You should not be here," she said quietly. "People like you do not come to neighborhoods like this alone." Hyunwoo gave the faintest shake of his head. "People like me stopped making sense the day you left." The hallway fell silent again. Somewhere outside, tires hissed through rainwater below the apartment building while an old radiator clanked softly behind Zarya's wall. Ordinary sounds. Human sounds. The kind Hyunwoo realized he had spent years avoiding without understanding why. His world had always been controlled. Cold elevators opening into private penthouses. Tailored suits laid out before sunrise. Meetings conducted behind smoked glass and expensive whiskey. Men speaking carefully around him because fear had taught them precision. Every inch of Seo Hyunwoo's life had been designed to project power. And it worked. People respected him instantly. They obeyed him instantly. But none of them knew him. Not really. Because power had a strange way of turning every room into a performance. Every conversation became strategic. Every smile became measured. Every relationship carried conditions hidden beneath polished words. Hyunwoo learned young that loneliness looked a lot like success from far away. Then Zarya arrived and quietly disrupted the entire architecture of his life without even trying. She did not care about his reputation. She cared whether he ate dinner before midnight. She did not fear his silence. She recognized exhaustion hiding inside it. One night 6 months earlier, Hyunwoo had returned to the penthouse after an 18-hour day to find the entire apartment dark except for a single lamp glowing beside the piano. He remembered loosening his tie slowly while the Chicago skyline glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows like cold diamonds against the snow outside. Most staff members had already gone home for the evening. But Zarya remained curled up on the couch beneath a blanket reading one of her library books. She looked up calmly as he entered. "You forgot your dinner again," she had said softly. No greeting. No nervousness. Just quiet disappointment. Hyunwoo remembered staring at her for a moment. "You stayed here waiting?" Zarya shrugged lightly. Somebody should. Nobody had said words like that to him in years. Somebody should. Not because they were paid to. Not because they feared him. Simply because they cared whether he came home exhausted to an empty room. He had stood there silently while snow drifted outside the windows and warm light wrapped softly around the penthouse for the first time in years. Zarya eventually rose from the couch and disappeared into the kitchen before returning with reheated soup and tea. "You cannot survive on coffee forever," she told him while setting the tray down near the piano. Hyunwoo remembered watching steam rise from the tea while something unfamiliar tightened quietly in his chest. Care. Such a small thing. Yet somehow more terrifying than threats ever were. Back in the hallway outside her apartment, Zarya studied him carefully beneath the dim light. "You are remembering something," she said softly. Hyunwoo looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I am remembering how peaceful my home sounded when you were inside it." Her expression flickered slightly at those words. Just enough for him to notice. Then she lowered her eyes toward the floor between them. "That was your mistake," she whispered quietly. "You started calling it home only after I was gone." Those words stayed between them like something fragile and unfinished. Hyunwoo did not move. Neither did Zarya. The rain outside had softened now, falling in slow streaks against the hallway windows while warm air drifted gently from her apartment into the cold corridor. Somewhere inside, the jazz record changed songs with a soft crackle. Ordinary. Peaceful. Human. Hyunwoo realized he had spent years believing silence meant control. But this silence felt different. This silence felt honest. Zarya finally exhaled slowly and loosened her grip on the doorframe. "You should not say things like that unless you mean them," she said quietly. "I do mean them." Her eyes lifted toward his again. Sharp. Careful. "Do you?" she asked softly. "Or do you just miss being taken care of?" The question landed harder than he expected because somewhere deep down, he had already been asking himself the same thing for days. Hyunwoo looked away briefly toward the rain-streaked hallway window at the end of the corridor. 3 weeks. 21 days since she left. 21 mornings waking up inside a penthouse so quiet it almost echoed. At first he convinced himself the irritation was temporary. A disruption in routine. Nothing more. But then the small things began unraveling him slowly. His coffee arrived too hot from the new staff. Nobody remembered to leave the piano room lamp on during thunderstorms. The housekeeper replaced the jazz vinyls with silence because she assumed nobody listened to them. One evening Hyunwoo returned home after midnight and found the entire penthouse dark except for city lights spilling cold blue shadows across the marble floors. He stood there alone holding his briefcase while the elevator doors slid shut behind him. No soft music. No scent of cinnamon tea. No quiet footsteps somewhere in the kitchen. For the first time in years, the apartment did not feel like a fortress. It felt abandoned. Hyunwoo remembered loosening his tie slowly before noticing something else. The small white orchid near the piano had died. He stared at it for almost a full minute. Strange. He had never even realized Zarya watered it every Tuesday morning until the leaves curled brown at the edges without her there. That night he walked through every room in silence, noticing invisible things she used to hold together effortlessly. Fresh towels. folded warmer than usual because she heated them first during winter. Handwritten reminders left discreetly near his medication when migraines kept him awake for days. Tea prepared before he even asked for it. Tiny details nobody else considered important because nobody else paid attention closely enough to notice when he was struggling. But Zarya always noticed. Back in the hallway, Zarya crossed her arms lightly and leaned her shoulder against the doorway. "You know what hurt the most?" she asked quietly. Hyunwoo looked at her immediately. "What?" A sad smile touched her face for only a second before disappearing again. "You never saw any of it while I was there." The honesty in her voice wrapped around his chest painfully. Because she was right. He had accepted her care so naturally that he stopped seeing the effort behind it. Like warmth from sunlight. Constant enough to become invisible until winter arrived. Hyunwoo lowered his eyes briefly before speaking again, softer this time. "That is not true." Zarya tilted her head slightly. "Then tell me something." He looked back at her. "What? What was my favorite song?" "Silence. Not cruel silence. Worse. Genuine silence." Hyunwoo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He knew how she took her tea. He knew she read before bed. He knew she hummed while cooking when she thought nobody listened. But her favorite song? He did not know. Zarya gave a slow nod like she had expected the answer already. Then she whispered quietly, "Exactly." The silence after her question seemed to stretch endlessly between them. Hyunwoo stood motionless beneath the dim hallway light while rain tapped softly against the old windows nearby, and for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar pressing against his carefully controlled composure. Failure. Not business failure. Not strategic failure. Something worse. Personal failure. Zarya watched the realization settle slowly across his face, and her expression softened for only a second before she tucked it away again. "You knew everything I did for you," she said quietly. "But you never tried to know me." Hyunwoo opened his mouth slightly, then stopped. Because there was no defense against the truth when it was spoken that plainly. He remembered one evening in late December when snow covered downtown Chicago in thick white silence. The penthouse windows had fogged softly from the warmth inside while jazz played low through hidden speakers. Hyunwoo had returned from an exhausting week of meetings overseas, running almost entirely on coffee and lack of sleep. His migraine had been brutal that night, sharp enough to make the city lights feel painful behind his eyes. Most people became uncomfortable around him during moments like that. His assistant spoke less. His security detail moved carefully around his temper. But Zarya never treated his bad days like something frightening. She treated them like something human. He remembered finding her kneeling beside the record player near the piano, carefully flipping through vinyl albums beneath the soft glow of the lamp. "You are awake late," he had said quietly while loosening his coat. Zarya glanced over her shoulder calmly. "You are in one of your quiet moods tonight." "I always have quiet moods." "No," she corrected softly while pulling out a record sleeve. "Tonight is the lonely kind." Those words unsettled him because they were accurate. Too accurate. Hyunwoo remembered watching her place the vinyl carefully onto the turntable before warm music drifted through the penthouse like smoke curling through darkness. Soft piano. Slow trumpet. The apartment immediately felt less cold somehow. "What is this?" he had asked. Zarya smiled faintly without looking at him. "Miles Davis." Hyunwoo remembered standing there silently while she walked toward the kitchen, humming softly beneath her breath. He should have asked then. About the songs she liked. About the books she read stacked beside the couch. About why she always looked slightly sad during rainstorms. But he never did. Because somewhere deep inside, Seo Hyunwoo had learned to accept care without believing he deserved connection. And there was a difference between those two things. Back in the apartment hallway, Zarya leaned lightly against the doorway while warm light framed her silhouette softly. "My favorite song is called Blue In." Green, she said quietly after a moment. Hyunwoo looked up immediately. Miles Davis? Genuine surprise flickered across her face. You remember that? You played it during thunderstorms. Her eyes searched his carefully now. Hyunwoo continued quietly, almost reluctant to admit it aloud. You only played jazz with piano when you were worried about something. Zarya's expression shifted slightly. Smaller now. More vulnerable. You noticed that? He gave the faintest nod. I noticed more than you think. The hallway fell silent again, but this silence felt different from before. Softer. More dangerous somehow. Because now both of them stood in front of a truth neither had fully admitted while they lived beneath the same roof. Zarya had spent months caring for a man who never knew how to ask for closeness. And Hyunwoo had spent months quietly studying a woman he was too afraid to need openly. The rain outside slowed to a gentle whisper against the glass. Then Zarya finally asked the question that had been waiting between them since the moment he appeared at her door. If you noticed all those things, she said softly, why did you let me leave? The question lingered heavily between them while the hallway lights buzzed softly overhead. Hyunwoo stared at Zarya for a long moment without speaking, and for the first time since arriving outside her apartment, something in his expression finally cracked completely open. Not weakness. Regret. Deep and unmistakable. Zarya watched him carefully, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the door as warm light from inside her apartment softened the tired lines across his face. She had spent almost a year learning how to read Seo Hyunwoo without words. The slight tightening of his jaw when stress built behind his silence. The distant look in his eyes when memories followed him home late at night. The rare moments when exhaustion made his carefully controlled mask slip just enough to reveal the lonely man beneath the power. And right now, he looked haunted. I did not think you actually would, he admitted quietly. Zarya blinked once. What? Leave. The word came out low and rough, almost unfamiliar in his mouth. Hyunwoo lowered his gaze briefly toward the rainwater gathering near his shoes. Everyone always stays, he continued softly. Even when they are unhappy. Even when they are afraid of me. They stay because of money, power, obligation, or fear. He looked back at her then, and the honesty in his eyes unsettled her more than anger ever could have. You were the first person who ever walked away from me willingly. The hallway seemed quieter somehow after that confession. Zarya felt her chest tighten painfully because she understood exactly what he meant. Men like Seo Hyunwoo built entire worlds around control. They expected negotiation. Resistance. Fear. But not abandonment. Never abandonment. She leaned lightly against the doorway and crossed her arms, trying to steady herself emotionally. You still have not answered the real question, she said quietly. Hyunwoo's expression darkened slightly with understanding. Because now they had finally arrived at the truth neither of them had wanted to touch directly. Why she left. His silence stretched long enough to become an answer itself. Then slowly, carefully, Zarya spoke again. Do you remember the dinner party 3 weeks ago? Hyunwoo's jaw tightened immediately. Of course he remembered. The entire night replayed in his mind constantly now whether he wanted it to or not. A private dinner inside the penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline. Investors. Politicians. Wealth wrapped in crystal glasses and expensive smiles. Hyunwoo remembered standing near the piano discussing business while soft music drifted through the room and city lights shimmered beyond the windows. Zarya had moved quietly through the evening serving drinks with her usual calm grace, invisible to most of the guests the way staff members often became in rooms full of powerful people. Until one woman changed everything. Celeste Laurent. Elegant. Wealthy. Beautiful in the cold polished way magazine covers often celebrated. She had spent most of the evening beside Hyunwoo, her hand resting lightly against his arm while cameras captured photographs neither of them cared about. At one point during dinner, Zarya accidentally brushed against Celeste's chair while refilling a wine glass. Barely a touch. But Celeste looked up sharply with visible irritation before speaking loud enough for the entire room to hear. Careful, she said coolly while adjusting her bracelet. Some people become too comfortable forgetting their place. Silence had spread instantly across the dining room. Zarya remembered the heat rushing into her face beneath dozens of watching eyes. But humiliation was not the part that broke her. It was what happened next. Or rather, what did not happen next. Hyunwoo had heard every word clearly. And he said nothing. Back in the apartment hallway, Zarya looked at him quietly while pain flickered behind her steady expression. I kept waiting for you to say something, she whispered. Anything. Hyunwoo closed his eyes briefly as if the memory physically hurt him now. Because it did. More than she realized. Hyunwoo kept his eyes closed for a moment after she spoke, as though the memory carried weight he could physically feel pressing against his chest. Rain slid slowly down the apartment windows nearby while the old hallway light buzzed softly overhead, but neither of them moved. Zarya had replayed that night in her head dozens of times since leaving the penthouse. The elegant dining room glowing gold beneath chandeliers. Crystal glasses catching reflections from the Chicago skyline outside. Expensive laughter drifting through the air while she stood quietly near the table pretending not to hear the insult aimed directly at her dignity. But the part she remembered most clearly was not Celeste's voice. It was Hyunwoo's silence afterward. She remembered looking toward him instinctively, almost hopefully. Not because she expected grand gestures. Not because she needed protection. She simply believed he saw her as more than furniture inside his world. But he had stood there perfectly composed beside the piano with one hand resting lightly against his whiskey glass while conversation slowly resumed around the table. Calm. Controlled. Untouched. And in that moment, something inside her quietly broke. I know what you are thinking, Hyunwoo said at last, opening his eyes slowly. His voice sounded lower now. Rougher. You think I chose the room over you? Zarya looked at him carefully. Did you not? The question landed softly, but it cut through him anyway. Hyunwoo exhaled slowly and glanced toward the floor before speaking again. I spent my entire life learning that emotions make powerful men vulnerable. He gave a faint, bitter smile that disappeared almost immediately. So when people are watching me, I become careful. Calculated. Controlled. Zarya's expression did not change. And that night? He swallowed once before answering quietly. That night I thought if I reacted emotionally, everyone in that room would see exactly how much you mattered to me. Silence. Deep and heavy. Zarya stared at him without speaking while those words settled painfully between them. Because somehow his explanation made everything worse instead of better. Do you hear yourself? She whispered finally. You cared so much about hiding your feelings that you let someone humiliate me in front of you. Hyunwoo lowered his gaze again. No defense this time. No explanation. Just truth. Yes. The honesty of that answer hit harder than excuses ever could have. Zarya looked away briefly toward the warm apartment behind her while emotion tightened painfully inside her chest. After the dinner ended, she said quietly, I waited for you to come talk to me. Hyunwoo's jaw tightened immediately because he remembered that part too. Perfectly. He remembered finding the penthouse unusually quiet after midnight once the guests finally left. Empty champagne glasses still scattered across the dining room. City lights reflecting against marble floors. He had loosened his tie while searching instinctively for signs of her somewhere inside the apartment. The kitchen was spotless. The piano room lamp remained glowing softly beside untouched tea. But Zarya was gone. He eventually found her standing alone on the balcony wrapped in a dark coat while snow drifted slowly beyond the skyline. Her back faced him. One hand gripped the railing tightly enough for her knuckles to pale against the cold metal. You should be inside, he had said quietly while approaching her. Zarya did not turn around immediately. Why? She asked softly. So I can remember my place better? Hyunwoo still remembered the pain in her voice. Small. Controlled. Worse because she tried so hard not to let it break completely. Back in the apartment hallway now, his chest tightened painfully at the memory. I should have defended you immediately, he admitted quietly. I know that now. Zarya's eyes glistened slightly beneath the warm light, but her voice remained steady when she answered. No, she whispered softly. You should have respected me enough to never hesitate in the first place. Hyunwoo stood completely still after her words, the hallway suddenly feeling smaller around him. Somewhere below the apartment building, a siren echoed faintly through wet Chicago streets before disappearing into the night again, but up here, neither of them moved. Zarya's voice had remained calm the entire conversation. That calmness hurt him more than anger ever could have. Because anger meant attachment still burned loudly. Calmness meant exhaustion. And exhaustion meant she had already spent too long carrying disappointment alone. Hyunwoo slowly ran one hand across the back of his neck, a rare gesture of visible tension from a man who usually controlled every expression with terrifying precision. You are right, he admitted quietly. I failed you that night. Zarya looked down briefly at the floor between them. You did not fail me, she corrected softly. You revealed something. His eyes lifted toward her again. What? She swallowed once before answering. That no matter how much I mattered privately, I was still someone you could leave unprotected publicly. The truth of those words hit with brutal clarity because there was nothing he could argue against. Hyunwoo remembered exactly what happened after the balcony conversation 3 weeks earlier. He remembered stepping closer toward her while snow drifted softly around the penthouse skyline outside. Zarya, he had said carefully, trying to explain himself without fully exposing the emotions he barely understood himself. You know that dinner was complicated. She laughed softly then. Not happy laughter. Tired laughter. Complicated, she repeated quietly while staring out over the city lights. That is the word rich people use when they want dignity to wait politely. Hyunwoo remembered the cold air between them that night. The silence. The way her shoulders remained tense beneath her coat while she fought to keep her composure steady. Celeste's family is involved in negotiations, he had explained. There were investors there. Politicians. Important people watching every interaction. Zarya finally turned toward him then, and he still remembered how much pain lived quietly inside her eyes. And I was not important enough. He opened his mouth immediately. That is not what I meant. No, she whispered softly. But it is what you showed me. Back in the apartment hallway now, Hyunwoo closed his eyes briefly as though hearing her say those words again physically hurt him. Because it did. The truth was unbearable now that he finally understood it clearly. He had spent years mastering power while completely failing at tenderness. He knew how to protect businesses, alliances, reputation. But he had never learned how to protect the feelings of someone who mattered to him openly and without hesitation. Zarya leaned lightly against the doorway, suddenly looking tired herself. Do you know what the worst part was? She asked quietly. Hyunwoo looked at her immediately. What? Her voice softened almost to a whisper. I still waited for you to come after me. Something inside his chest tightened painfully. After I packed my things, she continued, I kept thinking maybe you would stop me before I reached the elevator. Hyunwoo remembered that night perfectly now. He had remained inside his office long after she left the balcony because fear disguised itself as pride inside men like him. He told himself giving her space was respectful. He told himself she would calm down overnight. He told himself emotions complicated everything. Then sometime after 2 a.m, he finally walked into the kitchen and noticed something sitting neatly beside the coffee machine. Her staff key card. Folded carefully beneath it was a handwritten note with only 6 words. Thank you for letting me stay. That was all. No anger. No accusations. Somehow that made it worse. Hyunwoo looked at Zarya now with something dangerously close to heartbreak hidden beneath his calm expression. I read that note at least 50 times, he admitted quietly. Zarya's eyes flickered slightly. Then softly, almost afraid to ask, she said, "And it still took you 3 weeks to come here?" Hyunwoo looked at her quietly after that question, and for the first time all night, he did not try to protect his pride before answering. "Because I was ashamed." Zarya's expression shifted slightly at the honesty in his voice. The rain outside had almost stopped now, leaving only soft drops sliding down the hallway windows while warm light from her apartment spilled gently across the floor between them. Hyunwoo lowered his eyes briefly before continuing. "The first week after you left, I convinced myself you only needed space." His mouth tightened faintly. "The second week, I realized the penthouse no longer felt like somewhere a person could breathe." Zarya stayed silent, listening carefully now. "And the third week?" she asked softly. Hyunwoo gave a quiet, humorless laugh beneath his breath. "The third week I realized I had built an entire life around pretending I did not need anyone." Those words settled heavily in the hallway. Zarya watched him carefully while something painful and tender moved quietly through her chest. Because Seo Hyunwoo was not a man who confessed weakness. Ever. The entire city knew him as controlled, untouchable, impossible to read. But tonight he stood outside her apartment speaking with the kind of honesty powerful men usually spend their entire lives avoiding. "After you left," he continued quietly, "I started noticing things I should have noticed much earlier." His eyes drifted briefly toward the warm apartment behind her before returning to her face again. The house became quieter, but somehow heavier. He remembered waking up one morning just before dawn after another sleepless night. Chicago's skyline had still been dark outside the penthouse windows while cold blue light stretched across empty marble floors. For a moment he forgot she was gone. He had walked automatically toward the kitchen expecting to smell cinnamon tea already brewing softly in the background. Instead there was only silence and the faint mechanical hum of expensive appliances nobody touched with care anymore. Hyunwoo remembered opening cabinets searching absent-mindedly for the tea she always prepared during storms before realizing he did not even know where she bought it from. The realization unsettled him more than it should have. Later that same day, his assistant informed him that the flowers near the piano needed replacing again because they kept dying unexpectedly. Hyunwoo stared at the orchid in silence before suddenly understanding something almost unbearable. Zarya had been quietly keeping fragile things alive inside his home for months, including him. Back in the apartment hallway, his voice lowered further. "I found receipts hidden inside the kitchen drawer after you left." Zarya blinked slightly. "Receipts?" He nodded once. "For groceries. Medication. Tea. Supplies for my mother's hospital visits." Her expression softened immediately. Hyunwoo continued quietly, "You spent your own money sometimes when deliveries were delayed." Zarya looked away quickly. "It was not important. It was important to me." The firmness in his voice made her eyes lift toward him again. He swallowed once before speaking more softly. "Do you know what hurt the most?" Zarya shook her head faintly. Hyunwoo's gaze remained steady on hers now. "Realizing you cared for me in ways I never even noticed while you were there." The hallway fell silent again. Zarya's throat tightened painfully because she remembered every small thing she had done quietly over those months without expecting acknowledgement. Heating towels before winter mornings. Learning his migraine's triggers. Calling the hospital discreetly to check on his mother when he forgot to ask himself. Small acts. Invisible acts. Love disguised as routine. Hyunwoo stepped half a pace closer then, careful not to crowd her. "I kept thinking powerful people understood control," he said quietly. "But losing you taught me something worse." Zarya's voice came softer now. "What?" He looked directly into her eyes when he answered. "That there is nothing more humiliating than realizing too late that someone made your life gentler, and you never thanked them properly while they were still beside you." Zarya looked at him quietly after those words, and for the first time since he arrived outside her apartment, the tension in her expression softened completely. Not surrender. Not forgiveness. Just sadness. Deep, exhausted sadness. The kind that comes from caring too much for too long without knowing whether you were truly seen in return. The hallway had grown almost silent now except for the distant hum of traffic outside and the faint jazz melody drifting from her apartment speaker. Hyunwoo noticed her fingers loosening slightly against the edge of the doorframe, and somehow that tiny movement affected him more than dramatic emotion ever could have. "You do not have to thank me for taking care of you," Zarya said softly after a while. "I did those things because I wanted to." Hyunwoo held her gaze carefully. "That is exactly why they mattered." Her eyes flickered faintly at the answer. He continued quietly, "Everyone around me does things because they are paid to. Because they are afraid not to. Because my name opens doors and closes conversations." His voice lowered further. "You were the first person in years who ever did something for me simply because you cared whether I was okay." Zarya looked away briefly toward the warm apartment behind her, blinking slowly as emotion tightened in her throat. She remembered countless nights inside the penthouse when Hyunwoo returned home exhausted long after midnight. The way he would loosen his tie silently while standing near the windows overlooking Chicago's skyline. The way loneliness seemed to follow him through rooms too large for one person to carry comfortably. She had recognized that loneliness immediately because she carried her own version of it too. That was the dangerous thing about quiet people. They learned how to recognize sadness in others without words. "You know," she said softly, "there were nights I almost knocked on your office door just to ask if you had eaten." Hyunwoo's expression shifted. Slightly. "Why did you not?" A faint smile touched her face, small and bittersweet. "Because every time I got close, I remembered you were still my employer." The truth in her voice settled heavily between them again. Boundaries. Titles. Power. All the invisible walls that had existed between them long before either of them understood what they were actually feeling. Hyunwoo lowered his eyes briefly. "I hated those walls," he admitted quietly. Zarya blinked in surprise. "You never acted like it." "Because I did not know how to cross them safely." Her breath caught softly at the honesty in his voice. Hyunwoo glanced down the empty hallway before continuing. "Men in my position are taught that closeness creates risk." He gave a faint shake of his head. "So I convinced myself distance was respect." Zarya studied him carefully now. "And now?" He looked directly at her when he answered. "Now I think distance was cowardice." Silence followed immediately afterward. Heavy. Honest. Real. Zarya felt her chest tighten painfully because part of her had waited months to hear words like that from him. Not grand declarations. Not dramatic apologies. Just honesty stripped clean of pride. Hyunwoo slowly reached into his coat pocket then paused, almost uncertain. That alone startled her. Seo Hyunwoo was never uncertain. Finally he pulled out a folded piece of paper worn slightly at the edges from being handled too often. Zarya recognized it immediately. Her note. The small goodbye she left beside the coffee machine 3 weeks earlier. Hyunwoo looked down at the paper briefly before speaking. "Do you know why I kept reading this every night?" Zarya shook her head slowly. His voice softened almost to a whisper. "Because those 6 words sounded kinder than anything I deserved after letting you walk away hurting." Zarya's eyes glistened faintly beneath the warm apartment light. Hyunwoo carefully folded the note again before lifting his gaze back to hers. And when he spoke next, his voice carried something she had never heard from him before. Fear. "Tell me honestly," he said quietly. "Am I already too late?" Zarya did not answer him immediately. She simply stood there. Beneath the warm apartment light while the question lingered heavily between them, fragile enough to break if either of them moved too quickly. "Am I already too late?" The words sounded strange coming from Seo Hyunwoo. Men like him were accustomed to certainty. Control. Immediate results. Yet tonight he stood outside her apartment with rainwater still darkening the shoulders of his coat, waiting quietly for an answer he could not command from her. Zarya looked down briefly at the folded note still resting carefully in his hand. She remembered writing it at nearly 3 in the morning while the penthouse sat silent around her. Her suitcase had already been packed beside the elevator. Every room in the apartment still carried traces of him. Jazz records. Whiskey glasses. The faint scent of cedar and expensive cologne lingering near his office doorway. She remembered standing in the kitchen holding the pen for almost 10 minutes because there were too many things she wanted to say and none of them felt safe enough to leave behind. In the end, 6 words were all she could manage without breaking her own heart. Thank you for letting me stay. Not because she wanted to leave. Because she had finally realized staying was hurting her more than leaving ever could. Back in the hallway now, she slowly lifted her eyes toward him again. I do not know, she admitted softly. Honesty. That was all either of them had left now. Hyunwoo's expression tightened slightly, but he nodded once as though accepting the uncertainty without argument. Zarya continued quietly, part of me was angry for days after I left. A faint sad smile touched her face. Then I became embarrassed with myself. His brows lowered slightly. Why? Because even after everything, I still missed you. Those words seemed to physically still the air around them. Hyunwoo looked at her carefully, almost as though he could not trust what he had just heard. Zarya glanced away toward the apartment behind her before continuing softly. I missed your terrible habit of working until sunrise. I missed hearing piano music through the hallway when you could not sleep. Her voice grew quieter. I even missed arguing with you about skipping meals. Hyunwoo felt something tighten painfully in his chest because those small details mattered more than dramatic confessions ever could have. They were real. Human. Built from ordinary moments that somehow became precious without either of them noticing in time. Zarya exhaled slowly and looked back at him. But missing someone is not the same as trusting them again. The honesty in her voice landed heavily between them. Hyunwoo nodded faintly because he understood exactly what she meant. Trust was not repaired through apologies alone. Especially not after silence had already caused damage. I know, he said quietly. That is why I did not come here asking for forgiveness tonight. Zarya blinked slightly. Then why did you come? He looked at her for a long moment before answering. No performance. No careful calculation. Just truth stripped bare at last. Because I needed you to know that losing you changed me. Her breath caught softly at the sincerity in his voice. Hyunwoo stepped no closer, keeping respectful distance between them now. 3 weeks ago I thought protecting my image mattered more than protecting your dignity publicly, he admitted quietly. Now I understand something much worse. Zarya's voice came almost as a whisper. What? His eyes never left hers when he answered. A man can own buildings, businesses, influence, and power, he swallowed once. And still be completely empty if the person who made his life feel human no longer wants to stand beside him. Silence filled the hallway afterward. Deep. Trembling. Real. Then slowly, almost cautiously, Zarya opened the apartment door a little wider for the first time all night. Hyunwoo looked at the door opening wider as though he could barely believe what he was seeing. The warm light from inside the apartment softened the sharp lines of his exhausted face while quiet jazz drifted gently into the hallway between them. Neither of them spoke immediately. Some moments became too fragile for unnecessary words. Zarya stepped aside slowly, giving him just enough space to enter if he chose to. Hyunwoo hesitated for half a second before crossing the doorway carefully. Almost respectfully, as though he understood this was not victory. It was trust being offered 1 inch at a time. The apartment felt small compared to the penthouse, but somehow warmer in every possible way. A soft knitted blanket rested across the couch beside open library books marked with handwritten notes. The scent of cinnamon tea lingered faintly in the air near the kitchen. Rain tapped gently against the windows while city lights glowed softly beyond them. Hyunwoo removed his coat quietly and stood near the doorway for a moment, taking everything in. Real life. Honest life. No marble floors. No assistants moving silently through hallways. No carefully controlled perfection. Just warmth. Zarya walked toward the kitchen without looking back immediately. "You can sit down if you want," she said softly. Hyunwoo obeyed without argument, something that would have shocked almost everyone who knew him. He lowered himself carefully onto the couch while watching her move through the small kitchen beneath warm yellow light. Familiar motions. The way she tucked loose curls behind one ear while reaching for mugs. The quiet rhythm of her hands preparing tea. He realized then that home had never been the penthouse itself. It had always been the feeling she carried into rooms. Zarya placed a mug carefully on the coffee table in front of him before sitting across from him in the old armchair near the window. Steam curled softly between them while the rain outside slowed to almost nothing. "Chamomile," she said quietly. "You always slept easier after chamomile." Hyunwoo looked down at the tea for a moment before giving the faintest smile. "You still remember that?" Zarya's expression softened slightly. "Some habits are difficult to forget." Silence settled gently around them again, but now it no longer felt painful. Just uncertain. Honest. Hyunwoo wrapped his hands loosely around the warm mug before finally speaking. "I ended things with Celeste." Zarya looked up immediately, surprised. "When?" "The morning after you left." Her brows lowered slightly. "Why?" Hyunwoo held her gaze steadily. "Because I realized I was building a future around appearances while losing the only person who ever made me feel understood." The honesty in his voice made her chest tighten painfully again. She looked down at her hands briefly before speaking carefully. "You cannot build a relationship out of regret, Hyunwoo." Hearing her say his name so softly after weeks apart affected him more than he expected. "I know," he admitted quietly. "That is why I am not asking you to come back to work." Zarya slowly lifted her eyes toward him again. Hyunwoo leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but unmistakably sincere now. "I came here because I wanted the chance to know you properly this time." The jazz record crackled softly in the background while rainwater slid down the apartment windows behind them. Zarya searched his face carefully, looking for traces of the cold untouchable man she once worked for. He was still there somewhere. But tonight another version of him sat quietly in front of her too. A tired man learning too late that tenderness required courage. "And if I cannot trust you yet?" she asked softly. Hyunwoo nodded once without hesitation. "Then I will earn it slowly. No grand promises. No dramatic speeches. Just patience. Respect. Effort." The kind of things she had once given him freely without asking for recognition. Zarya looked at him for a long moment before finally reaching forward and gently sliding the second mug closer toward him across the table. A small gesture. Barely noticeable. But Hyunwoo understood immediately what it meant. Not forgiveness. Not certainty. Just possibility. And for the first time in years, the most feared man in Chicago looked at something fragile without trying to control it. He simply held it carefully and hoped it would stay.